Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Justin Cummings, Mayor for the City of Santa Cruz. We find ourselves in this peculiar time in history where the world is being threatened by a virus that requires a societal response to slow its impact. Without a vaccine, individuals and communities throughout the world have chosen to shelter in place in the interest of protecting those who are most vulnerable and to do their part in flattening the curve. Locally, daily conversations have begun to take on a common theme. Neighbors and friends often say to one another, "In my lifetime, I've never experienced anything like this. I'm having difficulty understanding how to get through this and what this means for the future." The Santa Cruz Public Libraries and Watsonville Public Library have invited several local leaders representing diverse faith traditions to help us give voice and a constructive perspective to the prevalent concerns and questions our community is facing. For the first time, this is the first part of our four-part series, Shelter in Faith. And we wanted to kick things off by having a discussion about crisis and recovery. Today joining us, we have Reverend Deborah Johnson with Inner Light Ministries, Pastor Jim Lapp with St. Stephen's Lutheran Church and Child Development Center, Reverend J. Shinseki, Watsonville Buddhist Temple, and Father Robbie Sullivan, Our Lady Star of the Sea. I'd like to start with Reverend Deb. Can you please go down the list of all of our guests today? And I'd like our panelists to please take about 2 minutes just to tell us about yourself and the faith tradition you're representing today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Reverend Deb as our first panelist.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for the Watson Public Libraries and the Santa Cruz Public Libraries for hosting this incredible series. It's such an important time. I'm Reverend Deborah Johnson with Inner Light Ministries. We are physically located on Soquel Drive, just a few blocks down from Cabrillo College in Soquel. And we are a radically, and I mean radically, inclusive spiritual community in terms of the people who come and participate with us literally from all over the world, as far as the different kinds of faith traditions that we practice. There are a fair amount of people who even identify themselves as non-believers or not having any faith in particular. But we come there to really grapple with the most important issues of the day and to come at it from a spiritual standpoint. So our perspective is that there are universal spiritual principles that should be applied to all of life's circumstances. Things about love, about healing, about forgiveness. We specialize in helping people to find their own personal connection to the divine. And we want you to use that, not just for your own personal benefit, but for the benefit of the planet, for the benefit of beloved community, for the benefit of social justice. So the perspective that I'm going to be bringing here today is that you are first and foremost a spiritual being, that life is not happening at you, to you, it's happening through us and for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Deb. I'll turn it over now to Pastor Jim. Oh, you're muted.
Pastor Jim Lapp at St. Stephen's Lutheran Church. It's actually in Live Oak, but we're just across the street from Harbor High School. And we've been in this community since 1954. We are part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And these days, I always have to qualify that word evangelical because it's come to mean something different in our common parlance. And I would consider us, distinguish us from that common understanding. Evangelicals in our name. 1987 we were formed as a national church because the original Greek word means the sent ones, and we see ourselves as the ones sent out into the community to serve, especially those in need. And a couple of ways that we've done that most recently is that we have used some land that we had in order to build 40 units of low-income senior housing in conjunction with the county and Mid-Peninsula Housing that serves some of our most needy folks, including homeless veterans. and people with certain physical disabilities. And also in our Untitled Child Development Center, and we started a preschool about 7 years ago, and so those are two of our hallmark ways we're known in the community. I've been pastor there for 24 years, congregation about 350 folks.
Great, thank you for that intro. I'll turn it over to Reverend Jay. Could you tell us about yourself and the faith traditions you're representing?
Thank you. Again, I'd like to echo the sentiment of others and thank the library and Mayor Cummings for putting this presentation on for us today. I'm really thrilled to be able to join the other pastors and reverends in this webinar. I've been the resident minister here in Watsonville for about 3 years. Previously in Monterey for many years. I'm still taking care of Monterey and actually the Salinas Buddhist temples that are affiliated with us. So I take care of the peninsula and part of the Pajaro Valley as well. Our tradition here dates back over 2,500 years to the time of the historical Buddha. Our particular sect of Buddhism, its founder comes from Japan. He was a monk of the 12th century, and it's called the Jodo Shinshu sect of Buddhism, which means the true Pure Land sect of Buddhism. Our temple here in Watsonville was founded in 1906, so we've celebrated over 110 years here in the Pajaro Valley teaching Buddhism. Our sect is the largest sect of Buddhism in Japan with over 7 million to 8 million followers and over 10,000 temples in Japan. I'm thrilled to be able to be part of this webinar, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you again for being here. And now I'll turn it over to Father Robbie to tell us a little bit about yourself and the faith tradition you're representing today.
Thank you, Mayor Cummings. My name is Father Robbie. I'm a native of Santa Cruz County, so it's nice to be able to serve our community here in my native hometown. I'm representing Our Lady Star of the Sea Catholic Church, which is part of the Diocese of Monterey and part of the Roman Catholic tradition. We are located in the Seabright area of Santa Cruz. I've been a priest for 6 years, so out of the baby priest mode, but still a young priest, and I've been here as a pastor of Star of the Sea for 2 years. So I'm still getting to know our community a little bit more. We're a very diverse community, serving people from all different nationalities and perspectives, and it's been a pleasure to be here in Santa Cruz. I used to come to Santa Cruz quite a bit as a child to play, but it's nice to live here and to worship too with our community. It's nice to be a part of this panel and to talk about such an important topic that we're discussing today. So thank you.
Well, thank you all again for being here and for bringing such diverse perspectives of our community into this conversation. So I'd like to start with a question. So looking back on the history of your faith tradition, was there ever a time it encountered a crisis similar to what we're facing today? And if so, what's the story and how did it unfold? And if there's anyone who would like to volunteer to go first, we can just raise our hands. Sure, Reverend Jay.
Thank you. So throughout the history of Buddhism, there's been crises and there's been famines and wars and disease. But I'd like to point out something more recently in our history. And this is a time when we're experiencing such separation. We're experiencing economic hardships. We're experiencing illness and death and a lot of suffering. And during World War II, the Japanese had immigrated here to the Pajaro Valley, established this temple. And with the outbreak of World War II, all of those Japanese were rounded up. They were incarcerated into concentration camps. And homes were taken away, land was taken away. They lost everything. And so they experienced an isolation and a economic devastation. They experienced racism, and the Buddhists were sort of the first to be separated from the rest of the community. They were targeted. And so as Japanese American Buddhists, we experienced this loss, great loss as a community. Now, today we are experiencing loss as well. Loss of income, loss of families, and loss of a community being able to come together. So in our history, the World War II experience is where we lost everything. But there was also an opportunity to coalesce as a community in a way, to be together and to create a stronger community, a stronger Buddhist community. So they were put into camps, but they continued to practice their faith. And this was probably what, in many ways, socially and psychologically saved many of the Buddhists during World War II, was their continued faith. And the ministers and priests were also incarcerated, so they were there to and able to assist their members during that time. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Jay. Reverend Deborah.
Ways to look at what's going on right now. And one of the angles that I'd like to talk about in terms of similarities is where there's a disparity in the severity of the cases and who's dying from the cases and the social justice implications of that. That to date within the United States, by far, the individuals who have been dying from it have been people who are older, people in nursing homes. We're finding some of the biggest spreads in the prisons, and a disproportionate number of African Americans and Latinos, very, very specifically. And this has taken me back so much, particularly in the 80s and the early 90s here in the United States, with the big onslaught of AIDS. And AIDS leveled us in a similar kind of way of Corona, the coronavirus, where we just didn't know, like, what was this thing and where was it coming from? And it was ravishing and playing such a havoc in a certain sector of the population, and similarly, sectors of the population that weren't given as much value in terms of their life. Nobody knew where it was coming from or how it was that you got it. But what I do know is that that experience took us to a whole other level of developing community, of having to care for one another, of being family. There was a sense of folks being almost lepers because you didn't know where they were getting it from. Families were abandoning other family members because of their quote unquote lifestyle or whatever that was. Even the church was turning its back on the LGBT community. But through it all, through the rally, through the deep belief, through the concern, and also pressing the government to respond, which is something I think is important in the middle of this crisis as well, is yes, there's a personal crisis that's happening and there's an economic crisis that's happening, but it also is showing the system that we have. I keep hearing people say, well, there's a breakdown in the system. And I'm saying, no, there's not a breakdown in the system. This is the system. And it's as though the curtain is getting pulled back and we're having a good chance to take a look at what do we build or what do we do. What I can say that's very different now is a sense of a collective responsibility and a sense of a collective, we're somehow in this together, and I'm going to shelter so that I don't spread it to you. Not just I'm going to shelter so I don't catch it from you, but this kind of awareness of a sense of responsibility that we all have an impact on each other, which is an extreme spiritual breakthrough. And I just want to acknowledge that and to say thank you for everybody for taking that initiative. Nobody has a gun to your head holding you at your house, but for your willingness to be part of a broader community and understand that it impacts us all.
Thank you, Reverend Deb. Pastor Jim.
Thank you, both of you, for those remarks. I want to come to both of your congregations. Okay, I want to pick up a little bit on our tradition, and specifically, I think that one of the ideas for this Shelter in Faith series actually came from a quote that was circulating, and it was from Martin Luther. So the Lutheran tradition goes back to the early 1500s, and Martin Luther was kind of the father of the Protestant Reformation, which brought a lot of needed cultural and societal changes. But this was the quote that we were circulating amongst my colleagues, because Martin Luther lived in the time of the bubonic plague. And here's what he proclaimed during that. He said, "I shall ask God mercifully to protect us. Then I shall fumigate, help purify the air, administer medicine and take it. I shall avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed in order not to become contaminated, and thus perchance inflict and pollute others, so cause their death as a result of my negligence. If my neighbor needs me, however, I shall not avoid place or person, but will go freely as stated above. See, this is such a God-fearing faith, because it is neither brash nor foolhardy." So that reminds me of why I'm a Lutheran Christian, is because, I was raised in it for one, so that helps. But also, Martin Luther's approach was a balance of reason and faith. And in this particular time, I want to be part of that church that is balancing those things out, that both can inform and both can be called upon. And I totally agree with what Reverend Deb said about thinking of our neighbor first, especially the most vulnerable. That is throughout the ministry of Jesus, of course. The other thing I'd like to bring up about our tradition is, as Reverend Jay lifted up, in World War II, our church, Lutheran Church, lost much of its soul. And it lost much of its soul because it capitulated to empire and government. And it did not, for the most part, speak out when it needed to and use reason. So I wanted to lift up a pastor who's one of my heroes, is Reverend Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was part of the resistance in that time. And he was able to recognize the injustice that was going on, and then was actually part of a plot to assassinate Hitler at the time. He was arrested and then executed only several days just before his concentration camp was liberated. But he wrote a book called Life Together. And in that book, he said some pretty amazing things about that relate to today and our crisis that we're facing. And the one I'd like to just lift up is those who love their dream of community more than the community itself become destroyers of that community, even though their personal intentions may be ever so honest, earnest, and sacrificial. So I wanted to lift that up as part of our tradition. It's very much in line with what both my colleagues have lifted up, that we are trying to think of those most vulnerable, and that our actions are thinking about the community first.
Thank you, Pastor Jim. And to just say, reflecting on what you said about finding that balance is definitely something we here in the city have been trying to do as well. So we can balance, how do we allow people to be able to access open spaces in other areas, and yet at the same time, really try to look out for everyone in our community. So I appreciate all that you've said and all that everyone said. And Father Robbie, I'll give you an opportunity to speak. Before I do that, for those of you who maybe have just called in, we are on our question. Our question right now is asking the representatives of our faith community to, as they look back on the history of their faith, was there ever a time it encountered a crisis similar to what we're facing today? And if so, what's the story and how did it unfold? And with that, I'll turn it over to Father Robbie to follow up on the question.
Thank you. Like what Reverend Jay said, our church has also experienced lots of crises. And the one that comes to mind that reflects most with what we're going through now is the pandemic of 1918, the so-called Spanish flu. And at that time, churches were also closing down for a time, not as long as we've been closed down now, but for about 2 or 3 weeks or so, they were closed, which was a radical change for believers whose thought was to go to the church and appeal together to God to deal with the crisis of that time. And one of the messages that the church had shared during that difficult time was the importance to pray. Of course, our churches exist so that we can pray together, which is extremely important. But in times when that's not possible, we can still pray and perhaps have more time to pray individually and increase our prayer. And so that message appeals to us today too, that we can take time, perhaps more time, to pray for one another, to pray with each other, even in isolation, and to continue to pray and hope for that time when churches will reopen and when we can pray together once again.
Great, thank you, Father Robbie. Okay, so moving on to our next question. How is your faith community finding new ways and building upon the wisdom and practices of your tradition to introduce hope during this public health crisis? Okay, we'll start with Pastor Jim.
I was about 24 years ago, myself and another Lutheran pastor in Watsonville by the name of Mike Wilker thought we needed to start building some power amongst our faith communities in order to address some of the things in our communities that were not going well, that we could do better at. And so we formed an organization of organizations called COPA, which is Communities Organized for Relational Power and Action, mostly made up of faith communities, but also some nonprofits. And that's one of the ways that we are finding hope in the midst of this, because we already had this network set up, and it was, on the ground running, working on things like healthcare, affordable housing, these kinds of bedrock community issues. And so when this came around, we had a foundation in place to be able to start to act on it. And so immediately we formed three task forces on, for instance, how to apply for the PPP loans and those kinds of things in vulnerable communities, how we could look at protecting undocumented workers who are really exposed in many ways in this kind of a situation. And so we have been working just right from the get-go on this. And we're part of a national network called the Industrial Areas Foundation, which we are now looking at ways in which nationally we can build our power so that these things can not be forgotten, especially again around those who are vulnerable. So that, being part of a faith community is pretty important. A lot of people these days talk about, and I understand it, being spiritual but not religious. And the lack in that, though, is that you're not part of a faith community of people where you can build some power for the good. If we don't build power in those kinds of bedrock institutions in our community, then we're saying, okay, market forces, okay, whoever's in government, go right ahead and do what you want. There's no civic engagement. So that's what we try to do in building hope amongst ourselves, is building some power so that some things actually get done. For instance, that housing that we have at our church, that doesn't happen without COPA, because we got $5 million from the county. That's an $18 million development. We're a 350 member church. We can't do anything. That was organizing work and building power to leverage our community resources to help build affordable housing. So that's just our example. But now in this situation, all new things open up, all new opportunities open up. I'm hopeful that this is kind of a wake-up call for a lot of us about taking better care of the vulnerable, about our disastrous healthcare system, and that we will be using this as we recover from this crisis to build a better society.
Thank you, Pastor Jim. Reverend Jay, you want to follow up?
Thank you very much. Am I unmuted? Okay. It's quite a challenge, to communicate with our members who were so used to gathering here at the temple, and now we can't gather. So we're trying to communicate with them has been a challenge, but we're doing our very best to stream live services, send out more communications, and trying to touch them in as many ways as we can, even with phone calls and things. And I believe that, so one of the hallmarks of Buddhist teachings is that we're all deeply connected to each other, that everything that we say and do and think affects other people. And another hallmark of the Buddhist teachings is that there are always causes and conditions for the situation we find ourselves in. So we're trying to reach out to our members and remind them of these deep connections. And these connections can be maintained even though we are physically separated, even though we can't be with each other. We can maintain those connections through understanding. This whole pandemic has made us realize that the things that are coming out of our mouths, a simple handshake, the things we touch, can then affect other people who we may not even know or see. And so the things that we do deeply affect others. And this goes beyond, the COVID-19. It speaks to the thoughts and the words and the actions that we do on a daily basis that can be harmful, that can be hurtful, that can touch other lives in ways in which we can't even comprehend. So through understanding this, there, I believe, is one of the ways in which we can create hope for our members, understanding that everything that we do affects others. So a smile, a good deed, a sharing, it affects other people. And there are this idea of causes and conditions. Everything that we are receiving too is a result of the sacrifices of all of our health workers, our farmers, our truck drivers, the grocery store workers. So what we have and what we're able to do, the lights, the shelter, are all the result of so many people sacrificing their lives for us. So that, in a way, makes us feel deeply grateful for what we have and what we've received. And this is where I believe that hope comes about through understanding of these truths. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Jay. Reverend Deb.
In our tradition, we define hope as an acronym, HOPE. Keep your heart open, stay in possibility, and engaged. Heart open, possibility, and engaged. And just a couple of the things that we're doing, some of them are adaptations, finding different ways to do what we were already doing. In addition to the online things, but different ways of being in community. So for a number of years, we have participated with Second Harvest as a food pantry distribution. So we distribute a couple of 1,000 pounds of food every week on Thursdays at noon at our center at 5630 Soquel Drive. It's open to anybody. Before COVID, we were doing something similar every other Tuesday as part of their passion for produce. But now we're just a Thursday. So we were closed for a few weeks. And that really hurt my heart, because I know how important food is. And now we've reopened and found, thank God we have a lot of space. We have 3 acres, almost 3.5 acres, and almost 17,000 square feet. So we have a big facility, and we can find ways to do the social distancing and all of that. But it's meant not giving up and saying, okay, how can we still meet the needs, even if it doesn't look like what it used to look like before? We've taken that community and expanded it. So now we're doing phone calls to local folks, and not just local folks, but anybody who's been connected to us, and checking up on them, getting groceries for them, delivering it to them. It's been a big learning curve for a lot of our seniors who haven't been that technologically inclined, and literally teaching sessions so that they learn how to do, Zoom and some of these other things. We have folks who are sewing and who are making masks. Just everybody finding ways in which they can use their skills wherever it is that they are, and really make a difference. And on the more, I guess I would say overtly spiritual side, is upping up that level of gratitude. Because our experience isn't just what happens, it's how we name what happens. It's our interpretation of what happens that makes it our experience. And if we're feeling like we're just a victim of this, we're going to miss a lot of the blessings. So we've been pumping up the gratitude in what's been coming out of this that is changing you, what's helping you make more connections, what's helping you get closer to your kids, and on out into the social level. We're big environmentalists. The ozone above the Arctic is closed. The biggest hole that we've had is now closed. And I bring that up to say that when you're praying for something, you never know what it really is going to look like. We've been praying for a wake-up call to get out of our mass consumerism. We've been praying for wake-up calls to kind of stop the treadmills that we were on, to become more conscious individuals and to participate more in global community. nobody thought it would look like this, but underneath it all, you gotta admit that it's been our answered prayers in many ways, and not to miss that, so that we're not trying to go back. We're not just waiting for things to open up again. This isn't just a pause button where you go back, that let us be transformed by this moment, so that when and as things do reopen, we're bringing with it the conscious intentionality that we wish there had been before. So we're using this time to recalibrate energetically, to kind of like up our game and our visioning of a world of possibility, so that we become some new people. We're not just hiding out while this thing is happening, but growing and healing and transforming and becoming visionaries to move things forward.
Thanks, Reverend Deb. Father Robbie, did you want to follow up on this question as well?
Sure. Yeah, I'm the youngest of 4 children, so I'm used to going last in things, and that's which is fine with me. So yeah, anyways, one of the things that we've been doing is trying to use technology more. Our church is not something that we've used technology well in the past traditionally, but we've been trying to use it more. And so things like live streaming masses and reaching out to the community, mainly through our website. We've been really working at that. We're also trying to reach out to people on a grassroots level, as many of you mentioned already, calling our parishioners, checking in with them, see how they're doing. We're making efforts to do that. So I find myself just as busy as I was before, just in a very different way. And one of the things that we've been saying often is that our buildings are closed, our office is closed, our church is closed, but the church is open. That we continue to do what we do, and just finding ways to do that through prayers online or in other ways, trying to communicate a sense of we're still open. I'm happy and pleased that our food pantry continues to operate and be open, as we've seen a growing number of people coming to receive food. And so, there's still a strong spiritual need, perhaps more than ever. And we have a very key role in ministering to those needs, but just in very different ways. So it's been challenging to learn these new ways and find ways to reach people where they are. I'm thinking about doing home visits, not actually going in homes, maybe driveway visits, where I stop in the driveway and visit with people from a distance, maybe give them a blessing or pray with them from a distance. And so we're constantly thinking of creative ways in which we can connect with people and minister to people, because the church is still open. Just our buildings are closed.
Great. And I think, one of the things that was touched on in this is just how this is such an opportunity, and really keeping that positive lens of not just looking at this as something that's kind of holding all this back and forcing us indoors, but, how are we using this as a way to connect with people who maybe we didn't connect with before, or also moving forward, even when we get to a point where we can open, now that we have these technologies, for people who might not be able to get to, whether it's a class or a church service or what have you, that this can now be a tool to expand the reach to so many other people. And so it's really inspiring to hear how all the different groups are using this as a way of not just, kind of shutting in, but using it as an opportunity to continue to keep and maintain those connections. So I'll move on to our next question. Even though we are still in the midst of our current crisis, people are beginning to ask, what happens when this all ends? Can things ever return to normal? And what do you see as the road to recovery? All right, Reverend Jay.
It's, everybody was hesitating there, but that's I raised my hand. I think that as we get into what I think is going to be a new normal, things will never be the same. Things are going to change, and these changes can be very positive changes. But I think one of the things that I hope that comes out of all of this is that a deeper sense of compassion for those that are suffering, and those that have lost jobs, and those that have lost family members. And that compassion is tempered with wisdom as we move forward. And not, once we've been able to overcome this COVID-19 crisis, there are other crises that will rear its head and be a part of our lives here in the United States. We have a very divisive sort of world in which we live in. There's still greed. There's still war. There's still people who are hungry. There's still homeless. And those are the crises that we need to take what we learned from this particular situation and utilize that wisdom and compassion as we move forward into this new world, and new normal, I guess we call it. And so I hope that we learn, but we also become stronger and more deeper in our compassion for others, and again, tempered with wisdom.
Thank you. Is there anyone who would like to follow up on Reverend Jay's? Sure, Pastor Jim.
Yeah, that's my hope for sure out of this. One of the, well, you can kind of see him back here, Martin Luther King Jr., my daughter painted that her senior year, giving his speech in Washington. So he's one of my heroes. And in his book, Strength to Love, we were asked to recommend some books, so that's one of them. But he says a lot of the same things, and it's my hope that there will be a more compassion that results out of this. One of our, bedrock stories for Christians is the story of the Good Samaritan. And Martin Luther King said this about the Good Samaritan story. He said, "I imagine that the first question the priest and the Levite asked, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But the Samaritan reversed the question to, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him?" And I see that opening up our society. What's the number one religion in America? I've always said in our church, it's consumerism. And this invisible enemy, as I've heard someone else say, kind of leveled all the playing field on that and reminds us more of our humanity. So I'm hopeful that out of this, we do come to a more compassion-oriented culture. And we do set up some things, as I mentioned, we're trying to do through COPA, our efforts, that change fundamentally the way we live together and the way we take care of one another. So that's one of my biggest hopes. The other is that, another thing Martin Luther King said was, only through an inner spiritual transformation do we gain the strength to fight vigorously the evils of the world in a humble and loving spirit. And I'm hopeful that this is that some inner spiritual transformation is taking place as we all face things we never thought we'd have to face in our lifetimes.
Thanks, Pastor Jim. Pastor Deb, before I turn it over, I just wanted to say too that, one of the things that really hit me with what you said right there is how we care for each other, because one of the things that we've seen happening right now is how many people are volunteering to make masks for folks, how many people are like, I'm going to make dinner for, some senior neighbors of mine, and I'm going to go check in on them. And I hope that as we move through this, that's something that sticks with folks, that, as we move out of this, we still are learning that we need to check in on the seniors in our neighborhood, and we need to try to see how we can take care of one another. And so I really hope, as you all mentioned before, that this compassion and sense of care for our neighbors in our community is something that we continue to see increase as we move forward. And so I'll turn it over to Reverend Deb.
Continuing on that same vein, I agree with everything my esteemed colleagues have said. I'd like to take this story just a little bit further that Pastor Jim was talking about, and related to what a vision of mine is that we can have going forward. The piece of the story about that Good Samaritan, so for those who aren't familiar with it, is that there's a man, he's a Levite, he's of the Jewish tradition, and he's on this trek on the Jericho road, which is this road. It's very, very steep, like 2,000 foot drop down from Jericho down into Jerusalem. And bandits take him, they rob him, they leave him bleeding, they take all his clothes, because in those days, clothes were collateral. And his own kin come by, the religious leaders, but nobody does anything with him. And you aren't even supposed to touch people who are bleeding. And then the Samaritan comes by and picks him up, puts him on his donkey, takes him to an inn, pays for him to be there for a couple of days, and says, I'll come back. And if he's not healed, I'll pay for him to stay some more. The Samaritan was the enemy. It's a very important part of this story, because when Jesus is giving this parable in scripture, the religious elite are challenging him on the commandments that he said, that the greatest commandment was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So the lawyers were trying to trip him up and say, well, who's my neighbor? So then Jesus gives them this story about this is what happened, and it's this enemy who's the one that responds, and Jesus poses the question, who's my neighbor? Who's the neighbor in the story? And even the lawyers had to admit it was the one who showed compassion who was the neighbor. And I'm hoping that part of what comes out of here is a new definition of neighbor. So neighbor doesn't just mean who's around in my community, who's in my geographic location, who's in my particular tribe. This love that Jesus said that you were supposed to have was a very specific kind of love. It's the Greek word agapeo. It's not the phileo love. It's not the Greek friendship, kinship, because we have something in common. This is a transcendent love. It is a choice love. It is a direction of the will. It's an unconditional love. So what I'm hoping that comes out of this is that the divisiveness goes down. That we have this sense of our neighbor being everybody. And that I'm not going to allow my caring, my efforts, my concern, my sense of goodwill be determined based upon some socio-demographic or identity politics kind of thing that might make me separate from you. I'm hoping that we come out of this with a different level of intentionality about how we spend our time, about how we spend our money, about what it is that we patronize, because we've been away from stuff long enough to not just go back on automatic pilot. From here on out, baby, it's choice. And I hope, as we say in the Black community, we stay woke.
Thank you, Reverend Deb. And it's interesting how we tend to talk about global economies, but we don't talk as much about global communities. And that's what the conversation we need to start having moving forward, for sure. Father Robbie, did you want to speak to this question as well?
Sure, yeah, and I just want to echo everything that has been said. That's really important moving forward, recognizing that we're all neighbors. Something that Reverend Deborah said earlier about seeing in this crisis opportunities or things to be grateful for. that can help us in the now can also be important in moving forward. And the road to recovery starts now and starts with choice. There are lots of opportunities present now, certainly lots of things that have been taken away in a sense, but lots of opportunities now that we can take advantage of to grow. We tend to, as a society, take advantage of opportunities that we have for pleasure or to feel good, and that's mainly because it's easy to do so. You know, if I go to the store and I see a sale on health food and a sale on donuts, I'm probably going to go for the donuts. It's much easier in that sense. But we have an opportunity to take advantage of areas for growth, which does challenge us, which does make things a little bit harder in a sense, but certainly much better for us as individuals and as a community. Opportunities to connect more with people, to call each other, to keep in touch with others, opportunities to pray for one another, opportunities to work on our own self-improvements, you know, to be the change that we want to see in the world, and it starts with us. So that, I think, moving forward in the road to recovery centers on our ability to make positive choices and take advantage of those opportunities for growth, however difficult, to do that now.
Absolutely. Okay, so right now I have one more question I want to ask the panelists, and then I want to open it up to the public. We've got about half an hour left before we kind of wrap things up, which should give us, you know, plenty of time for people if they want to write questions in. So if you'd like to at this time, there's a Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. But if you're at a computer and you can type in a question, your questions will go in the Q&A box, and then we'll try to get to those questions as they come in. But the last question I have for the panelists before we move on to public questions, is there a book or other resources you can recommend for our listeners to try today that is relevant to our topic of crisis and recovery? Pastor Jim.
Okay, she got it. Yeah, I mentioned a couple of books already. I just want to list them again. Life Together by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Strength to Love, Martin Luther King Jr. And then this last one, because this quote that I found really relates to what Father Robbie was, and everyone has said already. This is called The Wounded Healer by Henry Nouwen, N-O-U-M-E-N, now W-E-N, Henry Nouwen. Anyways, in that book he says this about, it's mostly a book about leadership, but he says this: every Christian is constantly invited to overcome his neighbor's fear by entering into it with him, and to find in the fellowship of suffering the way to freedom. And I think that speaks not only to, you know, this disease that we're all facing, the suffering that it's causing, but I liked that this can also be something that gets at the divisiveness of our society, and that by entering into each other's suffering, we can overcome some of that divisiveness. So I just wanted to lift up that book too.
Thanks. Any other book recommendations? Father Robbie.
Yeah, just a couple I brought with me. One is a book called The Best Is Yet to Come by Greg Laurie, about hope in difficult circumstances and difficult struggles, that, you know, to always keep our view focused on hope and that things will get better. And then the other one is 1,000 Gifts. And this book is by Ann Voskamp. And this book focuses on seeing all our blessings in everyday circumstances, no matter what we're experiencing or what we're going through at the moment, to see gifts that are present every day.
Thanks, Father Robbie. Reverend Deborah?
There are several that I would recommend. Practically anything by Dr. Howard Thurman. My favorite collections of his are in a book called For the Inward Journey. A lot of those also appear in Meditations for the Heart. I'm also very fond of Mark Nepo's The Book of Awakening. And I find myself gravitating towards Marianne Williamson's Return to Love at this moment right now. It's an expose on A Course in Miracles. And at the risk of sounding like I'm doing marketing, I'm really not, but one of my own books I think is very good for this moment. It's called The Sacred Yes. The Sacred Yes. It's volume 1 of a series called Letters from the Infinite.
Great, thanks, Reverend Deborah. Reverend Jay, do you have any books that you'd like to share?
Books there in the library, but this is one of my more recent favorite books. It's called The Buddha's Wish for the World. And it does describe, the Buddha's desire to embrace all beings, irregardless of background, irregardless of where they come from, and that we are all connected. And he says in here, in this world, there is no life that it was ever lived in vain. There is no life that is meaningless. All life is linked together. All of us share in the light that the Buddha shines upon us, and this is what the Buddha teaches. And so I highly recommend this book, The Buddha's Wish for the World. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all for those wonderful recommendations. And given that this is being recorded and will be on the website at another point in time, there's going to be a way to access this. But I think one of the things we'll hope for, and we'll try to see if we can make happen, is we can take those book recommendations and make them available on the website. There's been a number of folks who have been asking for that, and so I think we'll try to make sure that we can get those recommendations in a place that is accessible, so folks can get these books and see if our library has them or find them through other sources. So thank you all for those wonderful recommendations. I'll go to one of the questions that was brought up by one of the members of the public. They said, the word compassion has been used by many of the panelists. What do you mean by compassion, and can you provide any tangible examples?
I guess I can.
Sure. Go ahead, Reverend Jay.
I believe there are two ways of looking at compassion. One is in this mundane world in which we live, we do our very best to extend love and caring for other beings. One of the hallmarks of Buddhism is that every living being has value, and that life has value. And so that compassion that we practice is to share what we have, to be kind to others. But there's also another type of compassion, and this is in Buddhism what we call the infinite compassion of the Buddha, that is extended to every single being in the universe. And it's not a limited compassion. Oftentimes when we look at ourselves and we think about compassion, we spread a net out, and yet that net doesn't include everyone. It's sort of a limited compassion, and we do our best to go beyond that, but it is limited in scope. The Buddha's compassion, on the other hand, is a compassion that is described as being all-embracing, limitless, timeless, and even for those who commit evil acts, the Buddha embraces those beings. And so, yes, compassion has been used a lot, and I believe there are those two different types of compassion that we have to understand.
Great, thank you for that. Reverend Deborah.
I don't know what Webster says, but when I use the word compassion, there are two things that come to mind. One is about an identity, an attitude, a perspective, where it moves beyond othering. You know, it's one thing for me to see somebody on the street and say, "Oh, that poor person, you know, glad that's not me." You know, "Oh, I feel so bad for them." But it's another thing when I'm looking at that person and I'm seeing a oneness there. That's a part of me that's out there on that street. I don't see it as some other, but where I feel it and it impacts me very deeply. And I'm not looking down at this person like me up here and, oh, I'm so glad I'm blessed and I'm glad I'm not them. But something arouses in me where there's a sense of connection there. That to me is part of that neighbor like embrace of the world. And when we get to that point, when I get to that point of the compassion, then it compels me into action. When I hit that point, then I'm more likely to do something. And as I said before, this thing that's happening now, where all of us are taking action around the world, where we can see we can make things happen if we just do it. So when that sense of the oneness, I'll call it, the lack of othering, compels me to take action, compels me to use my resources to do something. It could even just honestly be as simple as a smile. That there is something that happens then that makes a connection so that the other person can feel my care. And it becomes a flow of energy then between us. And it's not just for them, but I get uplifted by my own acts of compassion, and we all rise up in the affirmation of that.
Thank you for that. Father Robbie or Pastor Jim, do you want to comment on this as well? No.
I'm going to have Robbie not go last, so, so that's okay. Yeah, a couple of thoughts about that. Immediately I thought of, we're a beach community in a lot of ways, and how the beaches are closed and how terrible that is for us. We just can't believe that. So compassion could be just something as simple as understanding that there's somebody out there where my going to the beach could potentially cause them harm. And that is what our public health folks are telling us. And so to trust that, trust the science behind that, and then have compassion and say, okay, that's the action. I'm not going to the beach at this time because I'm thinking of my neighbor. It's been brought up in the story of the Good Samaritan, and was brought up about the two main commandments for Jesus, loving God and loving neighbor. The other thing, though, is that compassion turning to action, which I appreciate from Reverend Deborah, but in a justice sense. There's the individual action, which I've kind of categorize in acts of mercy or charity, but then there's acts of justice, and that means talking about why things are the way they are, and trying to reform these things so that we don't keep running into these problems. And so working towards organizing ourselves and building that power through organizations like COPA that we're a part of, so that the compassion takes on a more rooted sense in our society, by the way we structure the way we live together.
Hey, Pastor Jim. Father Robbie, do you want to speak to this? I saw you unmuted your mic.
Oh, no problem. No, I'm good. I think we can go on to the next question. Everything that people have said has been good. So, yeah.
All right. So next question, how do we support and encourage our physical neighbors to not throw parties? It can make me feel anxious, and I'm trying not to worry during this crisis. I miss hanging out with my friends in person too, but I'm trying to keep my community safe. And so to the extent that you all can maybe speak to that, I guess we'll open that up for discussion as well. Sure, Pastor Jim.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. Because, I've lived in my neighborhood for 24 years, and we've had our, differences of opinion and things like that. And these are kind of long-standing things. If you decide to say something, what does that mean down the road for your relationship with your neighbor and so on. So I really empathize with that question. I, of course, don't have the answer, but what we have done, we have approached our neighbors, not about this issue, but other issues, and tried to model a way of talking openly about things without being judgmental, and just letting them know you care, letting them know that, you may have a story yourself of someone who is, in that vulnerable population that you could share with them, and look at it that way so that they could connect, on that level. This is drawing us closer. Our neighborhood, we did a little bit of an organizing of our neighborhood for people's needs. It hasn't really led to too much conversation, but this may be the opportunity to do that. This is something that is, I don't know if it's unique just to American society, but it surely is a hallmark of our society that we hardly even know our immediate neighbors. And so this is an opportunity to help break that down. Approaching it, you got to be careful, but maybe having the courage to do that, to overcome that fear. That's what we're all doing these days, is having that courage to overcome our fears. So this is another example of that. So I'd encourage that person to do that in some fashion if they can find that courage.
Thanks. Reverend Jay?
Yeah, I agree with Pastor Jim. This is a really difficult dilemma and that we put ourselves in. And the only thing I can think of is that we can lead by example and do our best to follow good safe distancing protocols. I think it was San Francisco Mayor London Breed who said, she doesn't want us to be policemen. She doesn't want us to go out and try to correct people in their actions. But again, I think it comes down to, as community leaders, teaching people of the consequences of the actions, that what we do truly affects other people, and not just our families, but those who are most vulnerable. And so continue to preach that best practices in everything that we do. So when I do my live streaming, we try to remind people, and they're probably tired of hearing it. At the same time, that I think it's okay to continue to emphasize those practices. Thank you.
Sure, Father Robbie, and then we'll go to Reverend Deborah.
Thank you. Yeah, just piggybacking on that a little bit. One thing that can work, depending on your faith tradition, is to pray for the other person. But how you pray is very important. So not just to pray, can my neighbor stop with these parties, or I pray that my neighbor will get a taste of their own medicine or something like that. But more of, I wish the best for my neighbor. I pray that my neighbor gets whatever they need, whatever they're desiring, whatever will help them. And be persistent with your prayer, but also sincere. I've tried this myself and it works wonders. But it's not always works in the way that we expect. And I think Reverend Deborah alluded to this earlier, that sometimes when we pray for things, it happens in very surprising ways. And I found in myself that when I prayed for someone else to change, and I prayed for the best for them, I ended up being the one changing. And it was great, and it worked out to be very fruitful. But we can't underestimate the power of prayer, and that it can, it can really work in very amazing and surprising ways. So I would just encourage to continue to pray sincerely and persistently for your neighbor as well.
Thanks, Father Robbie. Reverend Deborah?
Thank you. Father Robbie said some of what I was going to say. But to take it on to the other end, that for my faith tradition, we're always talking about there's only one of us here. There's only one of us here, and trying to really take an inner look at where am I in consciousness in regards to this. So when I hear the question, I hear it in a couple of pieces. I hear what we've already talked about, which is the neighbor and how do we deal with the neighbor. But I also hear the internal angst and fear, and that will take its toll even more than the party. Like the party could be like 3 hours, but that internal angst and fear that the one feeling it is going to be lasting all day. So there's this place where, and it's a critical place that you really don't want to get to. You don't want hopelessness and helplessness to come together. That's a really bad combination. So whatever it is that you need to do to make yourself not feel so helpless, to increase the sense of vulnerability, which increases the fear. So that praying or whatever that is that you got to do, visualizing it, not only for the neighbor, but for your own self as well. If I were to look at my ancestors that are from the African diaspora here in the United States, that portion of my heritage, that they were in a profound way in which they didn't have any rights. They couldn't go and talk to the massa and have him to stop doing what he was doing that was impacting them. But they had a way of being able to be transcendent. And no matter what it was that massa anybody else was doing, a sense that they could still survive, that they could still be whole, not making a God out of people, places, and things to have the ultimate say on my health, my wholeness, my possibility. So as important as it is to try to actually take action with the neighbor, within your own self, gain a sense of self-power back about you and your community, and don't cede it over to the neighbor and what they do, which you may not have any control over. Stand in your sense of well-being regardless of what they're doing.
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful message to send, that, we all have to take care of ourselves during this time, and, reminding ourselves what we can do to keep ourselves safe is number one. And I just wanted to follow up with that too, follow up on kind of some of the things that have been said, because another way, if someone really feels like they want to approach their neighbor, you can always, write them a letter and drop it off, tape it to their door, and just let them know that you're concerned about them, and that, we're going through this time. And as a neighbor, some of the activities they might be doing are concerning to you, and, give them your phone number. Maybe you can call and have a conversation and really try to connect with one another if you haven't connected before. Because I think that's a lot of what we're going through here, is trying to connect with one another and to have these, somewhat uncomfortable conversations where we a lot of us are in a very difficult place, and we're trying to find ways to cope. And it might be that house that's having that party, it's all people who live in that home, right? But then that helps you by learning, what's happening. And if not, maybe being able to have a conversation with them around how that can impact folks is also meaningful as well. So, Reverend Deborah.
Yeah, and I'd just like to piggyback on something that was said earlier. I think it was Pastor Jim, about going into each other's sphere. That kind of like grief, that I think is going to be the next section, where people respond differently. So we may be looking at somebody having that party and interpret it as they don't care. It may be their way of responding to their fear, that maybe they need people to come together and to get this sense of, oh, this isn't getting the better of us. We're still whole. We still have some kind of agency, their way of not feeling so hopeless. So you can't always interpret in people's responses that they don't care or that they are the opposite from you. It's just like you have fight or flight. They're both responses to fear, even though they may look different. So you may actually be more closely in line than you think, and just taking very different ways of doing it. It's like mama dies. One brother wants to sell the house right now. The other, because he just can't handle it, the other brother wants to make a museum out of it. Don't touch anything. And they're both doing it out of love, even though they may have very different ways of going about it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Well, we're getting close to being done with our time. And so what I thought we could maybe do in the last 10 minutes is if any of you had any final thoughts you'd like to share on this topic, and then maybe we could kind of do a brief introduction of what's going to be coming in the next session. And so if anyone wants to start with kind of some final thoughts they'd like to share on our topic today.
I'll go first this time. Change of pace. Just a simple phrase that we often say in society: keep hope alive. But that's so important in this time of crisis and recovery, to cling to hope. That hope exists in some way, in some form, and very often in unexpected ways. And to not only just cling to hope, but be an agent of hope as well. Bring hope to others. Bring hope in whatever way we can, clinging to our faith traditions as well to help us and guide us and move us through this. And then I just also like to say, as this will probably be my final comment, thank you to my colleagues. It's been a pleasure to meet you and work with you in this way together. And thank you to Mayor Cummings and to the Watsonville Library and Santa Cruz Libraries for putting this together. This has been a wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Reverend Jay?
So, crisis creates pain and anxiety, but also an opportunity to learn and grow. And I think part of recovery is to learn about ourselves and how we handle crisis. Learn about ourselves and how we can move forward in times of difficulty. And I think it makes us stronger, not only individually, but as a community. And so I really appreciate the comments that everyone shared today, and I echo Father Robbie's sentiments that I really enjoyed meeting you virtually, listening to your comments, learning from you. And I do hope that our relationship is not just a virtual one, but in the future we can all meet in person. And thank you for your time and comments.
Pastor Jim?
Yeah, certainly along the same lines. It has been really good. We do have some of this connection through COPA, but I haven't been able to spend any time with any of you. So that would be my final thought, was that those who have participated in this to this point, whom we can't see, that you could see there's a pretty diverse representation of faith communities, just the four of us. They're out there. And I want to encourage people to find one. I mean, it doesn't really matter which one so much, but to find a faith community to be connected to would be my final thought. There's going to be many others coming, in the next few sessions here. We got 3 more in this. And so, yeah, my final thought was to thank the organizers at the Santa Cruz Public Libraries in Watsonville for bringing us together. It was really a great idea, and this has been a rich time with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Reverend Deborah.
Well, I echo the sentiments that have been shared here about the gratitude for having this arena, this forum, this space, and for everybody who's listening now or that may be listening later. I think my parting words would be about the recovery aspect. There's recovery that you have, say, for example, if there's a hurricane and you're busy trying to rebuild the houses and rebuild that community. But there's also the kind of recovery that happens, say, if you are trying to overcome addictions. And that's a different kind of recovery. You're not trying to rebuild the house that you were in before. You have to come up with a whole new way of life. And I think we need to just get very sober about the fact that life as we've known it, it's just not going to be that way anymore. Even the simplest things of the way we all used to shake hands. I don't know how long or if we'll ever go back to that, so to speak, as a tradition. And the point that I'm trying to make is that we're going to have to actively engage and build society. We don't know what it's going to look like. Just because they open up the doors doesn't mean everybody's going to rush in. Who knows how long it's going to be before they're concerts or big sporting events, or how that is that the proximity even, that we stand next to each other. I mean, these are just the most simple, basic things. But we're going to have to rebuild society. We're going to have to and we're going to have to figure it out. There's not going to be a playbook. There are not going to be guidelines coming down from the CDC. Nobody's going to tell us how to do it. We're just literally, just like a democracy, we're just going to have to show up, stay engaged, and figure it out. And it may take a long time. It honestly may take a couple of years, few years, before we settle down into something that honestly feels like a new foundation upon which we're standing. Stay present, hope, keep your heart open, stay in possibility consciousness, and keep engaged.
Thank you for those words, and I think that's a good spot for us to kind of end. And so I want to thank, again, Reverend Deborah Johnson from Inner Light Ministries, Pastor Jim Lapp, St. Stephen's Lutheran Church and Child Development Center, Reverend J. Shinseki from Watsonville Buddhist Temple, and Father Robbie Sullivan, Our Lady, Star of the Sea. Thank you all for being here today and for sharing those wonderful words with our community. I'd like to also thank the Santa Cruz Public Library and Watsonville Public Library for putting on this amazing event where we've been able to hear from members of our faith community, leaders in our faith community, about crisis and recovery. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. Oh, I don't have that capability, but I just want to let folks know that the next session in the Shelter and Faith series will be on grief and loss, Wednesday, May 5th from 3 to 4:30 p.m. During this session, the topic will be finding comfort and help for coping with grief and loss as faith leaders share hopeful practices conducive to sheltering in place. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Please stay safe. Please stay healthy. And we hope that you'll tune in again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
And on behalf of the Santa Cruz Public Libraries and the Watsonville Public Library, I'd like to thank all of our attendees today for taking time out of your day to join us for our Shelter in Faith series. We will post the book recommendations and the recording soon within the next day or so. And as Mayor Cummings mentioned, please join us for part 2. This will be this Wednesday at 3 p.m. You'll register the same way you did for this session at santacruzpl.org, and there you'll find parts 2, 3, and 4. And of course, thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your wisdom and your insight today. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.